everyone. I want to welcome all of you to EdTech Maryland Meetup. Tonight we'll be talking about education post-COVID and what did we learn from that experience. This event is sponsored by JBS, Custom Software Solutions, Think, and we have Andrew Hampton, PhD from the University of Memphis with us this evening as well. Just want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to go over the agenda for this evening, what to expect. So first of all, welcome to EdTech Maryland Meetup. First, we'll have our moderator and panel introductions. Our panelist discussion will be real-time Q&A during the presentation. So you'll notice that you have a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So as the panelists are talking this evening, please feel free to submit your questions live. If there's a good break in the conversation, we'll answer or ask those questions live during the panelist discussion. But at the very end, we do have an attendee networking opportunity for 30 minutes. And that's where we'll bring all of you from attendee status to panelist status, so we can meet and greet, talk with the panelists, ask your questions live, and really get an opportunity to get to know each other. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Joe Rose, president of JBS Custom Software Solutions. He has a wealth of experience, technical knowledge, and track record of meeting and exceeding expectations for both consumers and also employees. He has a bachelor's and master's degree in computer science from Georgia Southern University. So Joe, will you take it from here and introduce our panelists?
All right, thank you, Laura. So before we dive into that, just to kind of give a brief recap, we are going to be going over essentially remote learning and what the implications that are, because that started for a lot of people a little over a year ago. And so we want to cover what did we learn from the transition, and then specifically as we transition back to in classroom, or some of us already have, what are we taking from that transition? What are we doing to make it better? So with that, let's introduce our panelists. Erica, do you want to go first and introduce yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Erica Finchen. I work for the College Board in their instructional curriculum area, working on the Springboard and pre-AP platforms for 6 through 12 students. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Erica. Drew?
Hi, I'm Andrew Hampton from University of Memphis. I'm a research scientist assistant professor. One of my primary tasks has been as the project manager for a hybrid tutoring system in electrical engineering that pulls together disparate learning resources into a single platform. I'm also the chair of an IEEE Standards Association working group for adaptive instructional systems.
All right, thank you, Drew. And Phil?
Phil Horowitz, and I am the chief architect here at JBS. And I've been at JBS for about 11 years, and I've been in the technology industry for about 25. And I'm currently working with Erica at the College Board as the lead architect for the Springboard digital platform.
All right, thank you for the introductions panel. So let's get started. Let's jump right in. What did we learn from the transition? And when we go back to school, how do we do that in a way where we can use some of what we learned? Drew, do you want to lead off with that answer?
Sure. So we learned a lot. Unfortunately, it was very chaotic learning. So I'm a classroom instructor as well, and I'm sort of built to do this kind of stuff. I've been talking about the affordances, the benefits of online instruction, of blended learning, but that doesn't mean I was ready to do it right away. So teachers who had the same curricula for a decade or more found themselves really struggling, and as we all did, to try to figure out how to work that into a classroom. But through that kind of chaos, we shook up the institutional inertia, all of the hesitancy to try new things. You didn't have that option to not try new things. So trying out new tools and teaching via Zoom, seeing how much you can expect of students, what kind of assignments they respond to better, how you can see analytics, how you can get a better idea of what your classroom is struggling with or advanced on, and then at the individual level as well. So we saw a lot of the benefits that we knew we could, but we were seeing individual instructors and at the institutional level being willing to try new things. And of course, the developers have been probably for a long time begging to get students in front of their systems, all of a sudden had more data than they were probably ready to deal with. So it has been a chaotic, but certainly a very interesting year in this field. And how do we go forward is well, I mean, we're going to be discussing that quite in depth as we go forward here. But the sort of the easy part is incorporating tech into classrooms, because teachers have seen that it's better in a lot of ways. The harder part is going to be kind of shaking up the pedagogical framework. And educational researchers for decades have been talking about how we rely too much on knowledge transmission. We the teachers have knowledge, we impart it, we sort of hand it down from the mountaintop. And that's fine, as far as it goes, but we would much prefer if there were at least some element of knowledge construction, where the learners have to interact with the content as opposed to just know what they need to know to get an A on the test. So moving toward that knowledge construction framework in some meaningful way is a bigger challenge that I think we have an opportunity to tackle.
I appreciate the answer, but the way you answered that almost made it sound like everything done in remote learning was good and we should just learn to apply that. Would you say that's true, or would you say there's some element of actually saying keep the good and get rid of some of the bad?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, there's really no substitute for some kind of in-person learning. And the big challenge in the fall is going to be, how do we decide what are the things that we should keep versus, going back to what had worked reasonably well beforehand. So it didn't mean to make it sound like this was, a all good year, certainly, but we have an opportunity is what I would like to emphasize. Okay,
great. So how does technology fit into that, and the techniques that we use technology to refine? Erica, what do you think?
I mean, I think, what we saw, like Drew was saying, we saw a lot of folks who were using technology and testing it out to such a degree that we've never seen before, for better or worse. I mean, I know it was a challenging, very, very challenging time for many folks to just sort of drop everything and kind of jump right into it. But, we saw a huge uptick in, for example, districts and schools really kind of making sure that they had, LMSs in their classrooms, and that they had sort of one digital ecosystem. One thing that I think a lot of districts have recognized, though, was that, the training of those ecosystems and the real curation of that content could certainly have been better than what they were able to accomplish in that, short span of time between school ending and summer being over for the following year after sort of March hit. So, I mean, I think that we're seeing people really focusing in on that training. And I think the other thing is, districts, now that they have been through this, are not wanting to sort of step away from remote learning. They know that it offers some flexibility, that students, some students have really thrived in this environment, and so some teachers as well. So it's important that we recognize those high points, as well as and thinking about, how do we ensure that those kids who are doing really well or appreciate that flexibility, and teachers who also did, can continue on that path, while maybe some others continue on in the classroom and apply what they have in a more blended learning environment.
Right. Thank you, Phil. Anything you want to add to that?
Sure. I think some of the other things that we're going to be seeing as we integrate technology deeper into the classroom and in our schools and systems of higher education, we're going to see ways to make a lot of the online and electronic platforms more engaging to the students via the use of things such as intelligent agents, which we'll probably speak a little bit more of later. And we'll see a lot of these systems offload a lot of the more boilerplate tasks and things, so the teachers can focus on the actual content and actually teaching and being more involved with their students. And we'll also see more tailored individual curriculums based on adaptive learning systems. And as adaptive learning systems continue to make improvements by incorporating a lot of some of the newer machine learning techniques and algorithms, we'll be able to see a lot of progress there in how we can better cater to how our students learn on an individual level as well.
Okay, you kind of hinted at this, but let me just ask you directly. Is there a difference between what a teacher does well and what a computer does well? Are they similar, or are there actual silos where you say this is something that a teacher does really well and a computer shouldn't, and vice versa?
Sure. Well, yes. So there are certainly distinct areas where teachers do far better than computers and technology ever will. And then there's areas, not to the same degree, but there's areas where computers obviously are fantastic. And when it comes to doing more repetitive type tasks, things like grading, scheduling, organizing, and stuff of that nature, computers they fit the bill there. That's really where they come to the fore. And one thing though that's important is that some tasks, there are definitely some tasks where lines may become blurred. For example, grading an essay or a paper. Obviously, that's traditionally within the realm of the teacher themselves taking on that kind of task. However, though, with a lot of advances in things like natural language processing techniques and computer vision and intelligent agents and so forth, being able to intelligently grade an essay or report now is starting to become well within the realms of some of the more adaptive learning platforms and learning management systems that are embracing some of the cutting edge right now.
All right, Drew, what do you think? Phil's obviously more of a technology perspective. Why don't you give us more of a teacher's perspective?
Right, and certainly there are tasks that computers are better at than a teacher could ever be, collecting and storing huge amounts of learner data. And in fact, there's a related project that I'm on. The National Science Foundation is funding a Learner Data Institute, where we're trying to find out how can we use these data to develop insights and to help teachers and to help adaptive instructional systems to better adapt to learners. But to a certain extent, the question is limiting. So it's talking about which tasks a computer does, which tasks a human does better, when we can be also asking what are the new tasks that are enabled by them working together. So if a teacher now has detailed insights onto what a particular student or what their class is struggling or advanced or whatever, that frees them up to act as the professional educators that they are, as opposed to just content delivery machines or grading machines. So using that automation or that automatic adaptivity to help teachers to do the more challenging and the more human part of their job is a really exciting frontier area that we're going to need to explore more to find out how we can get teachers and systems to work better together to build past what we have now.
No, it's interesting the way you answered that. I guess you call that a bias in the question of me saying A or B, and you're saying A and B together really are stronger. Well, maybe we can dive in specifically on the actual technology that's involved here. So, Phil, what are the specific pieces of technology and tools? Can you dive into a little more detail on what they actually are and how they work?
Sure. So, I mean, we have some more traditional types of student information systems, electronic learning platforms, and assessment platforms. Like an example, that would be Learnosity, for example. And then you get more into the adaptive type student platforms, where there's kind of, Drew mentioned this in his prior answer to the last question, where We have systems that are constantly making adjustments and assessing based on various kinds of pattern recognition algorithms and data mining and analytics to be able to recognize individual needs and then in almost real time cater to those needs. And a lot of that stuff for many people who are building these kinds of systems and running them sounds very, very far-fetched and very, very far in the future. However, though, a lot of the building blocks that go into making a system like that are being, at this point, heavily commoditized by cloud providers like AWS and Google Cloud Provider and Microsoft Azure. And because of this commoditization, they allow us to integrate a lot of these technologies into our existing platforms, and they offer with not nearly as invasive as we would have had to 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 50, or even if you go back further than that, it would have been almost impossible. Now it's, a lot of those hurdles are being overcome. And in addition to new systems development via exposing the functionality of these building blocks via accessible APIs that are easy to integrate using various kinds of data standards, and not to get too technical about things like JSON, XML, whatnot. They're very easy to integrate into the systems, and they'll allow us to take advantage of the kinds of benefits we can get from things like pattern matching and more intelligent type of algorithms. And we can really start using these things as a basis to build much more richer functionality into our learning systems that will, A, allow teachers to focus on the message and the nuts and bolts of teaching, and B, allow us to better tailor what we're teaching to students on the micro level.
Okay, so one thing you said in your answer, I just want to get clarification on or clarify. You said the cloud providers have all these algorithms now available, and at least in my recollection, it used to be that only large companies could do things like this. Say maybe the military or and not every educational company or university or school has massive financial resources to apply these types of algorithms and technologies. So are you saying now that because they are cloud provided, they are now much more accessible? Is that true from a technology perspective and a cost perspective? And
yeah, it's true for both. The scenario, typically, just take kind of like the typical machine learning or artificial intelligence kind of learning algorithm, the life cycle there. You would have to, let's just go back to something as early as maybe 5 or 6 years ago. You'd have to find someone who would actually be able to code the actual algorithm itself. And that takes a serious amount of specialized expertise. Probably some PhD in statistics or computer science or mathematics, something along those lines. You have to code the algorithm itself. And then once you have that coded, then you have to make sure that you have a large enough data set to actually train the algorithm and give it the quote unquote intelligence that it needs to learn from all the data that you would feed it. And then you have to test it and train it, and then ultimately put it into production somehow on your platform, and that entails all the typical things we see in the operational aspect of putting one of these systems into production. Things like fault tolerance and performance, and making sure it works at scale. If you have a platform that supports 900 schools or 10,000 schools or 100,000 schools, you got to make sure that it all works at whatever scale you're going to roll your platform out. And to get that kind of system into production, even is something, 5 years ago or so, you're going to need a lot of people, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. However, because of companies like Amazon and Google, who have made the overwhelming amount of advances in this area, they've been able to now take a lot of these algorithms that would have required a tremendous amount of specialization to code. They've been able to commoditize these and turn them into pre-built blocks that you can then incorporate them into your systems. And then, you know, at that point, you're able to leverage them. And because it's the cloud, like most cloud services, you only pay for what you use. So they can be considerably less costly than doing it yourself.
No, I think that's great. Obviously, that's something that, you know, it's a new dawn in a sense of enabling technology in the classroom. So with that thought in mind, put on your prediction hat for a minute, Drew, and tell me, what does it look like when we go back? Are we in person 3 days a week and at home, or do we have computers in the classroom, or like what? So just make it real for me. What does it look like when we're back in the classroom?
It will depend vastly on your learner population. So I'm a college professor. I'm going to be in the classroom the 3 or 2 days a week that I was going to be for whichever class, and then I will have online assignments and automatically graded tests, quizzes, whatever. But hopefully there's more infrastructure on the system side to support more detailed analytics and insights, because a lot of those things I had well before. I think the biggest benefit we're going to see is that pretty much every teacher expects to use those things to some degree or other. I had a conversation with a colleague pre-pandemic, and I mentioned I was teaching intro psych, and she said, "Oh, that's terrible. I really like intro psych." She says, "Yeah, me too, but it's so much grading. It's so much time I have to spend just marking down the same exercises semester after semester." And I said, "I've never graded anything. I set the grading key, and then I just find out how my students did afterward." And that's not the kind of conversation that I have to have anymore. It's understood that we can automate a lot of the tasks that are not really a good use of the time of professional educators. So we will see that. I think we've kind of gotten the foot in the door of technology in the classroom. We expect it to be there, even if it's not in the physical classroom, it's in the curriculum. So as that tipping point has kind of been reached, it makes more sense for systems, for companies to invest in educational technology. And as those get better and better incrementally, it makes more and more sense for the teachers to incorporate it into their classroom. So I think we have reached a point where we're on the glide slope. We're moving toward a more technologically integrated classroom and just learning experience generally. At least that's my optimistic take.
Do you think that applies at lower levels of education as well, or do you think it's just at the college level?
So lower levels are tricky for a lot of reasons, and notably it's because they're controlled, the curricula are controlled at a much higher level. So you have to go through school boards and teachers unions and all of these hurdles that don't really exist for a college professor. If I want to rewrite my entire curriculum, nobody's going to ask me about it. You can't do that with a fifth grade classroom. So the argument has to be made in a different kind of way, but I think the general principle has gotten through, that this is a better use of resources. It's a more efficient use of resources. It's empowering teachers. All of those main ideas that we need to get across, I think, are largely through. It's just it's more a question of implementation and of policy reorientation that honestly I'm not an expert on.
Okay, now Erica, the College Board Springboard platform is an educational tool for lower education. So your opinion here obviously would be incredibly relevant. What do you think?
I mean, I think I would agree with Drew that we've definitely seen districts try to make a shift, but there's definitely an aspect of whether or not the districts are able to make those choices that they really want to make. At an independent, I mean, I used to be a classroom teacher as well. So as a independent person in your own, having your own authority over your own classroom, you do have some ability to make some choices. I think the real challenge for teachers right now is really time to actually make those choices, and whether or not their students actually have access to that technology. I mean, for the most part, we've seen a huge infrastructure boost around the nation to make sure that kids have the correct devices, they have web access, etc. But there's still a huge gap that exists, and until that gap is, really narrowed in such a way that more students have access to the right devices at the right time, it's difficult for middle school, high school, elementary school teachers to really provide that lesson wholly digitally and expect that everybody's going to be able to do it and have access to it. So those are the types of infrastructure conversations that I think need to continue on next year.
So it's a combination of time, infrastructure, state law, all of that kind of rolled into one. So along that lines, how do you guard against learning loss as you implement these things? And it somewhat relates to an audience question, which was, how can we address the issue that handwritten paper notes and books seem to be superior for memory, retention, and understanding? So how do those, it's a concern, right? We don't want to put in new systems and actually be worse than we were before. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in the time of COVID, kids went through a diverse experience, right? Some kids were in school the whole time, but, we're moving between remote and in person. Some kids were fully remote this past year, and some kids, because of their living circumstance, really couldn't attend school consistently. I think teachers are used to having a certain amount of, diversity within their classroom of how the skills that kids are coming in. But this is definitely diversity at a range that I'm sure everybody is going to feel a little bit less comfortable with. I think what's really important there, though, is to think about how can we target those skills to accelerate learning. So rather than going back and saying, okay, now I need to reteach, I'm now teaching an 8th grade science class, I need to reteach 7th grade because I missed that, and then bring them all up. It really should be about what specific skills they need to assessing whether or not they have specific skills to meet the curriculum that is most valuable within their school year. So it's really almost like a prioritization exercise. I mean, I would encourage teachers to really be thinking about, what are the most important elements of my course? What do I really need my kids to get to? And let's prepare for the fact that some kids are going to come in with those skill gaps. And I think to Phil's point earlier, technology can do a lot with skills gaps and repetitive sort of teaching, sort of that prep work that's needed to make sure that kids you can isolate and assess what those specific skills are, and make sure that if it's something that they really need to be repeated teaching, you don't have to take away the entire classroom's time to do that. You can really set a student on its own trajectory with the right curriculum and technology in place.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you. So just to play devil's advocate for a minute, if I were to say you're given multiple choice tests, and sure, that makes grading it easy, but how are you really evaluating a student, especially in a remote environment? Drew, what's your response to that? Say just for the sake of argument, I'm telling you I don't believe you, and that won't work. What's your response?
So evaluation, standardized evaluation on a large scale is really only done maybe a couple of times a year. And that's sort of how we make a lot of our big decisions in terms of education on a societal level. Assessing as we go was never practical in the past. We couldn't very well have standardized tests at the end of every week. And even then, it's Friday, I'm stressed out. You're kind of setting up just mini versions of the high pressure tests that we have now with their, various problems. Notably, we have people that don't test well. They don't do well in that environment, and the pressure or the time constraint or whatever else. If we had some kind of standardization of exercises or of a type of instruction that we could assess as they go. Every time they interact with the system, they can have a bad day, and that's not really going to impact our understanding of them as a learner. We have so much more data if we are incorporating this into a blended or an online environment, that the big question is, how do we standardize that, and how do we understand progress across different platforms or resources? So I think we will be moving toward standards in online education. What that will look like, it's a massive challenge, and this is part of the IEEE work that I've been doing, standards for adaptive instructional systems. We had started pre-pandemic 2018 or so, but it's a big project. We didn't get it done in time, but we're still working on it. So I'm optimistic that we can have this not continual, low stakes, but more frequent evaluation and assessment of learners to find those more detailed patterns of learning.
So would that go as frequently as daily, you think?
It could be as frequently as every 30 seconds if they're answering a batch of questions. There's really, what the granularity will be is an open question. Is it useful to kind of track if they've learned something this week? I think that's probably a pretty easy question to answer. Is it useful to know that the hour after lunch, students don't do very well? They're not learning at the same rate that they were the hour before lunch. Yes, that's probably useful as well. So what the granularity of your analysis is will depend largely on what the question you want to answer is.
Okay, no, I appreciate that answer. So just thinking back on it, the systems that have been built or proposed have always been kind of a wholesale replacement of your classroom. Instead of using pen and paper, you're going to use this computer, and you're going to sit your student in front of this computer all day long. And the panel has made it sound like more of this is a hybrid approach. This is not meant to be a full replacement. It's not meant to, kind of as a corollary, make teachers feel threatened. They're not being replaced. They're being supplemented. So does that help lower the resistance to implementing that? And if not, what are some of the other things? Because that's a problem too, right? As great as this technology is, if you don't have the teachers on board and actually implementing it, you're kind of dead in the water, right? But Drew, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of systems have sort of justifiably failed in the past by pretending that they can be the whole answer, because it's really hard to build a system in collaboration with instructors and more so with school boards and teachers unions. So having, again, that idea that this is making your lives easier, that it's growing the pie. It's not saying these are the tasks that are getting taken away from you in order for a computer to do. It's saying these are the tasks that you no longer have to spend time on so that you can spend more time being a professional. The things that you went to school to get a master's degree for, you can focus on those instead of grading papers. So yes, I think to a large degree, we are trying to make that argument, and to a large degree we've succeeded.
Now, Erica, obviously the Springboard platform is one that you train teachers on and try to get teacher adoption. So what's your view on that? Is that something where has it gotten easier? Has it gotten harder? Is there certain techniques that you're using to help with adoption?
I definitely think teachers who have been really embracing this and have found unique ways to become really successful. I was reading an article, for example, about a teacher who was teaching the physical properties of within life sciences, and during a Zoom call is asking her kids to go on a scavenger hunt to find a specific object that has the property of buoyancy, for example. And yeah, exactly, like that's the type of thing that the curriculum is never telling you to do that, and it's getting kids up. They don't have to sit and get. And I think that's the change that we kind of need when it comes to those techniques that we want to put in, because it's not about, we have, lots of instruments, Padlet and Kahoots and various other, applications that we know that are really prevalent within the classroom that do great work at engaging students, but a lot of it does exist in terms of what's the lesson that the teacher is creating. And I know that we have some really creative thinkers out there, but we also need to kind of provide that curriculum that will support teachers who are just not thinking outside that box, who aren't thinking like, who are thinking of it maybe more, when I read that, I was thinking to myself, when I read about that teacher, I was thinking, wow, I wish we did that at work, because we often are sitting on these Zoom calls, and it does become really, your full day, you're just sitting there. So thinking about how to use these primarily business applications to really engage students, I think is the way to go.
So what about, say, if you have older systems, Phil, is there a way to incorporate some of what we're talking about and to breathe new life into older technology? You're on mute, Phil. Mentioning technology.
Honestly, I think the answer is yes and no. A lot of it depends on just how old of the system we have in place, But in many cases, and this I guess would be more directed towards the vendors of such systems. We can incorporate some of these into some of these older systems. And again, it gets back to kind of the building block approach that I was talking about with the commoditization of a lot of these pieces, whether it's using something like a machine learning algorithm from AWS, or whether it's just plugging in something like Google Classroom. Most of the integrations are based on standards that have been around for quite some time now. In some cases, at least the last 10 years or so. And it's, if you're using standard data exchange formats or file formats or APIs, then it's not, it's not this massive Herculean task to start incorporating some of these newer technologies and newer pieces of functionalities into your older system. Obviously, the caveat is that the more current and recent your platform is, the easier this is going to be, and the more seamless the integration will be. But regardless, it's definitely possible.
So if there was somebody out there who had an older system, say it was 5 or 10 years old, would you tell them that's too old, or would you say, hey, you should have a look at it at least and see what you can do?
I definitely think it would be worth taking a look at first, a very comprehensive look at that. And only after that due diligence and research would be done would I think it would be worth making any kind of final decision based on whether to move on to a more modern platform or take what you have and start incorporating some of these more modern pieces of functionality that are now available.
So on the topic of old systems, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think Drew?
Yeah, I was just going to say a lot of systems are at least attempting to be much more modular in their development now. And it's the electronic system that I worked on in another project. We want to build pieces that can accept other systems or tools or else be used by other platforms. So that kind of modular approach combined with, again, I keep saying standards, opens the door to getting your system into some other system, so that it's not such a burden for the learners or for the whoever's buying the systems to, buy 12 different systems. They can buy one thing that has 12 different tools in it.
Yeah, that's hopefully everything is like that forever, because that, as new things come out, you can continue to plug in modules and you never have to worry about my system is too old again. Now, a lot of these systems have been, yes.
We did have a question from the audience that I think is kind of pertinent to this discussion. They were asking, the real question is, what digital learning system has produced significant results in student learning or specific content standards expected by the public? Do you guys know of anything that's on the market currently?
I'm sure there is. You guys have anything?
So, I mean, it's really about making sure that students are meeting content standards. Is that what the question is? I'm sorry, can you just
Well, I
repeat
guess the question is there a system out there, and I'm kind of restating this person's question, where you can say it's been implemented and we can look at the results that it has produced and say, yeah, this is actually working?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work that we've done on Springboard has definitely supported that for sure, as we've made significant improvements to the system, not to toot mine and Phil's own horn there too much, but I definitely think that our work there has, we've tried to pull that, tried to make that as usable as we can from a technical standpoint. I mean, there are lots of systems out there that I do think that, you know, really do support students' learning of specific content standards. I mean, you know, I'm sure we've all worked on many varieties of this, but I think it's important to really just be assessing each tool for and have a comprehensive evaluation of the system when it comes to your specific needs. That's how I would sort of go about it. Because every tool is going to be different. You know, it's just really important that you're looking at it from that standpoint.
Is there anything measurable that you could speak to? So for instance, you know, if you say pre-Springboard test scores are here and post-Springboard test scores are anything like that you wanted to call out?
I mean, we don't do like a typical growth assessment type situation where you could say a pre and post test, for example. But I do think that there are systems out there, you know, it does allow, for example, in Springboard for you to be able to, you know, and quickly analyze and understand what students are scoring and isolate questions that they're not doing well on, for example, and be able to, you know, correspond with students and provide direct feedback to them. So I think those types of things are the things that I'm thinking are really important for a system. But there are a variety of tools out there that do exist, that do, you know, growth measure assessments that can provide, you know, I mean, I've worked on, for example, Lexia, which is like one of the first projects that I worked on, is a reading software that sort of can actually predict the growth of a student and actually predict whether or not they're going to do well on a state standardized reading assessment. This was for a K through 6 student, so different age group, but there are lots of varieties of tools out there that are really great at making sure that students, you know, are prepared.
Yeah, in terms of, so the question is a good one. And the reason we don't have just a list of them right off the bat is because usually it's either a private company and they're not particularly interested in doing a controlled randomized experiment, or it's run out of a university and then we don't have enough people to say we ran it at scale. That said, I know of at least a couple of systems that would meet the criteria. The ALEKS system, that's ALEKS, for teaching math to, I think, middle schoolers, was deployed at least Shelby County wide and demonstrated learning gains above a control group. Mathia out of Carnegie Learning has similar results in the Pittsburgh area. Assessments out of Worcester Polytechnic Institute is more of an LMS plus kind of thing where teachers can add their own questions in and then other teachers can use them. But that has demonstrated learning gains at a pretty impressive scale. The AutoTutor family of systems, which is meant to, it's a conversational agents to teach deep conceptual understanding, has demonstrated learning gains over control groups in a lot of different areas. Not all of them at scale, but some of them definitely are, including adult literacy. So there are systems out there that have shown that we're not just talking theory here. This has worked. We have tested it rigorously and scientifically and shown benefits over conventional learning approaches.
All right, no, thank you for that answer. I think we're ready for the live Q&A at this point. We made it through the core of our agenda, Laura, so I think I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to be promoting you to panelists, so everybody's going to be joining the room here in just a moment. We do have a couple questions from the audience that came in earlier. So panelists, how can the creative teachers and thinkers get visibility to share their insights? Was one of the questions that we had from the audience that came in earlier.
So I'm sorry, to clarify, it will be like an individual teacher has found a creative way to use their system, or to use the constraints of Zoom or whatever else?
I think that I don't know, Michael, I'm going to move you over. Maybe you can speak up as to what you were looking for there on that question. You should be moved over in just a minute.
Earlier it was mentioned that there are some really creative superstar teachers, you know, the ones that sent the kids out into the woods, or the ones that held up a hand mirror in front of Zoom so that you can use Zoom itself to teach networking delays and things like that. And how do we, you know, expose these superstar teachers or these creative techniques so that others can hear about them?
I don't think we have a mechanism in place, which is a shame, because we could certainly use one. So I think we just have to wait for them to go viral on TikTok. Not a very good system. I'd love to hear if there are alternatives.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, I mean, I think it's you know, it's interesting. The times that I've been reading about it, it seems to be anecdotal, you know, in a newspaper report or in some article that is really interesting, where they've gone in and actually found a teacher, and or TikTok. So it is a really interesting point. I do think that there are a lot of creative solutions that are out there, but you know, some products like Teachers Pay Teachers, etc., it's not focusing on this type of digital learning, or digital remote learning experience. It's focusing on, you know, pay another teacher for a worksheet type work, or, you know, so because of that, there's not really that core product that is really focusing on that.
All right, so another question here, and this was in the Zoom chat, not the question and answer session. Do we need to worry about students getting burnout sitting in front of technology or screens all day?
I'd say we need to worry about students getting burnout, full stop. The constraints of that are different. In a Zoom platform, you know, it's we all know it's exhausting to kind of compose your face and then look at people this close for hours on end. So certainly breaking that up with different kinds of exercises, but in the same way that, you know, just lecturing at a student for 4 hours in a classroom is probably going to put them to sleep too. So integrating different kinds of exercises, moving people around is certainly something that we need to consider. And that might be a little bit harder when we're fully remote. So that's, yes, we do need to worry about it. Okay, would you say it's more likely to have burnout in one scenario or the other? Or I mean, so I guess more specifically, are technology-driven remote learning environments more apt for burnout than a traditional learning environment? I don't have data for that, but yeah, I would say yes, almost certainly, because you don't have that kind of organic social interaction. You can't lean over to your friend and, you know, make a joke or whatever. It's just difficult to maintain focus when the social component is abstracted. That's a good point too. I guess the teacher can't read the social cues of the room, and
say, uh-oh, I'm losing everybody here. Let's spice things up. All right, let me grab another question here. Can electronic systems be used to teach engineering itself recursively? For instance, holding up a hand mirror on a Zoom call to teach about networking delays and AV synchronization.
Yeah, I don't see why not. Using technology to teach technology is very commonplace. And as educators become more comfortable with incorporating these kinds of things into their teaching and, leveraging the things that they do well, and I definitely think that there's no reason why that kind of approach shouldn't be adopted. I think it's certainly an opportunity to, instead of having people in front of the technology and being passive recipients of whatever happening, I think it's a good way to explore different ways of interacting with your students. And I think this dovetails a little bit with the prior question about burnout and sitting in front of the screen. One thing we've learned from video games and gamification is that it's actually not too hard to keep people engaged in front of the screen. It all depends on the kind of interaction that's happening, and by enabling technology to be used in this kind of interactive fashion, I 100% believe that those kinds of approaches are viable.
I would agree, and I'd say this is really a particular example of the same kind of thing Erica mentioned with go find something that has the quality of buoyancy. So just using the environment to amplify your teaching, and if the environment is mediated, it's digital, use that if you can. Great, that it transcends it's transcending the medium by using the medium. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's using what you have available to amplify your instruction. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, worst case, they're going to learn how to type at least, right? All right, next question. What's the best way to develop a creative yet large-scale tech concept, such as AI that safely pairs up students to teach each other, time scroll bar to rewind a live collaborative meeting if a student doesn't hear something, et cetera? So, Phil, I think that's something that there's a lot of rigor and process that goes into developing something and actually deploying it at a grand scale. You can't just write some code and sling it out and say, yeah, it's good to go.
Yeah, and that's the difference between the scale of having something experimental that you and a couple of your students might be playing with and experimenting with in the classroom, versus a system that you're planning on rolling out to 100 different thousand schools or universities all across the country. There's, when you get into those economies of scale, there's whole problems and issues that come up that you would never have to worry about on the smaller side of things. Something as simple as trying to find a log message to help diagnose an error in the system is something that, if it's not done well, it could mean all the difference between being able to troubleshoot an issue in your system within minutes or hours, or in some cases, maybe not getting to it at all. So there's a lot of operational and architectural aspects that go into building and designing these systems. I kind of mentioned some of them earlier in the beginning of the session, things like fault tolerance, robustness, traceability, observability, performance and scale, and making sure security, making sure all these things are taken into account and factored into your system's architecture, so that when ultimately your system reaches its production environment and you have students and teachers banging on this thing all day long, it's going to work, and there's going to be no surprises. And if there is an issue, it can be resolved promptly and expeditiously, and that the vendor themselves have the things needed in the architecture of the system to give them the insight into what is happening to that system at any point in time. So monitoring, and behavioral aspects of the systems. So there's a lot of knowledge and expertise that needs to go into getting a system like that in scale, in production, and making sure that it actually is going to work and run in its intended fashion.
So Erica, same question, but from a non-technical perspective. If there's a piece of technology or a concept that you're going to roll out on a large scale, even if you just say, okay, the technology is good to go, we can flip it on and it'll scale all that. Is there any thought or prep work that has to be done to do that at a large scale, just from a pure business process or feature set functionality perspective?
I mean, if you're rolling out a piece of technology at a large scale, it's really important that, especially when it comes to training, that people really understand what it is, that you've made sure to test the technology really well with users to make sure that it's meeting their needs and expectations, and that you kind of are making sure that you're making sure that the users are going to be satisfied with that minimally viable product. I mean, to make sure that they actually understand that there is a true need that you're meeting, and that you have sort of a list of enhancements that you want to do, but that are not necessarily important right from the get-go. But training is super important as well in communication. So communicating that you're releasing it, and then communicating, also training people on how to do it. So when we roll out new features or technology, there's always a communication stream that's led, for example, by our marketing team to kind of communicate out to external teachers the right language that makes sure that it makes sense to them from that real layman's terms of what it is doing. And then also to make sure that we're working with our professional learning team, for example, to incorporate it within their rollout of specific training sessions that they're doing. So that, for example, when we recently released, our teaching and our new teacher and student reporting system, that teachers really understood how to use it, what the value of it was, and that they're ready to incorporate it in their next school year in order to analyze student data and make sure that they can make the right instructional decisions for the following year.
Well, great, thank you. Next audience question here. What are the top technology capabilities that made the most impact with the sudden shift to online learning? What actually worked well? So I'll ask our three panelists, if you had to pick one thing where you said, this is the one technology that hands down made the biggest difference, what would you say it is? Phil, you want to lead off?
Sure, and I'm going to lead off with the most obvious, and that would be the systems like Teams and Zooms that have been key enabler. I mean, look, it's video conferencing. It's from a problem domain, it's very mundane. But could you, the question I would posit would be, could you imagine what last year would have been like if we didn't have those platforms? It would have been impossible. And we would have gone from maybe not the best and not ideal to absolutely nothing at all. And, one of the benefits of this is that because these kinds of systems have been stressed to their utmost limit in terms of, what works with them and what doesn't, we've found a lot of gaps, and we've learned a lot about things that do work and don't work when we're using these kinds of platforms for education. And so I think in the future, for some who might not like it and for some who think it's the greatest thing on the planet, we're only going to see more of this. And one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting is how These are going to go from more passive platforms to more interactive platforms by putting in and allowing the ability to incorporate intelligent agents and all different kinds of ways to engage the people participating in meetings with the AI being able to handle things like breakout sessions and being able to create highly intelligent chatbots and assistants to make sure that there's a certain level of engagement that we haven't had prior to.
No, thank you. I think you answered that in incredible detail. The first person was going to answer Zoom, so at least you didn't say Zoom and move on, right? You gave a ton of other color past that. So now with the easy answer out of the way, Erica, what would you say your answer is if you couldn't say Zoom?
I mean, some of the instructional technologies that I think really were that were really helpful were also used, I would say, pre-pandemic. I mean, we saw, an uptick in use of, things like Kahoot, which I mentioned, which is like an assessment software where teachers can write in questions and students can use their mobile phones to answer. And it can create in classroom, it can create kind of a Jeopardy type scenario. And outside of the classroom, it can still create that without having to all be together. So it's a nice interactive tool. Similarly, Nearpod certainly did some nice integration work. I think they integrated with Google Classroom. They went beyond just a presentation tool to students, a presentation and question answer type tool. They really sort of made it more robust. I'm just thinking of some of the other instructional tools. I mean, some of the newer ones, like I mentioned, Padlet or Flipgrid, those types of collaborative softwares, which can actually be used, we use them internally from a business standpoint, but they can also be used in the classroom and really create that sort of collaborative space outside of just, I think Google Docs for sure, already had it in terms of being able to everybody collaborate and write in the same space. But this set up different scenarios where students could really brainstorm or organize their ideas in a way that, would allow it. And Flipgrid, just from a video, perspective, being able to create something, that was, I guess, a little bit more focused on education and really providing, a synchronous experience for them. So, I mean, there were a bunch of instructional technologies that I think really worked really well. And I think the through line with all of them is that they were simple. Like, you didn't need a ton of instruction to be able to do it. Kids got it. They liked it. They were engaged with it. They didn't have content in them necessarily, but they were the types of things that, teachers could quickly and easily apply in their classrooms to make the experience less, sit and get.
All right, thank you for that. So I'm going to go to Drew, and then I'm going to turn it over to Susan after Drew and see if she has a question or wants to follow on to that answer. So Drew, go ahead.
Sure. And I'll be honest, when Phil said he had the obvious answer, I thought he was going to take mine. But I would just say LMSs, learning management systems, just being adopted almost universally. Every higher ed anyway, but a lot of high school teachers I know, and grade school, middle school, whatever, were using LMSs in a way that we really had not seen before. So just getting them onto a platform that would enable more advanced or more interactive computer-based learning features was such a huge step forward or an enabling step forward to move the whole conversation into a different realm.
All right, thank you. Susan, floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. It's been an interesting conversation, and Phil, I really appreciated particularly some of your perspective around like the role of technology and algorithms and things like that. One of the things that I haven't heard too much in our conversation today is when we talk about algorithms, we talk about, or some of us think about bias in those algorithms, and how do we think about, as we build these algorithms and leverage machine learning and leverage AI and scale this up, how do we make sure that we're doing that in an equitable way, in a way that's not embodying bias and supporting a vast range of student experiences? So
wow, what a great question.
Yes, that is actually a fantastic question. And for anybody who's been following AI ethics and ML ethics, obviously in technology, that's been a very, very visible area at the moment. Google kind of learned the hard way that it might want to pay some attention with that several months ago, which resulted in quite a few very, very smart people leaving Google, as a matter of fact. So the answer is it's not easy. I mean, obviously, some of the people involved in creating these algorithms, as we can see, they're having a very hard time of it themselves. And the ethics involved are, I think, it's obviously I don't have the answer, and honestly, I don't think anybody really does. And the one thing that I do like is that it's become something that's been, at least in the technology industry, it's become something that set of questions and the issues that arise, especially with the biases that we see in a lot of some of the classic machine learning algorithms, as those become more visible to a widespread audience, and as we see them being trained on larger and larger data sets, we're seeing where some of the inherent problems lie. And we're having, it's a very active field of research, and we're seeing now people try to attack those kinds of problems where before they weren't visible several years ago. But there's been a lot of well-known, quite frankly, well-known disasters that have happened over the years. Microsoft and Twitter is one of them. For those of you who might not know, Microsoft released a quote-unquote intelligent bot released it on Twitter with the idea that we would not know that this was a person or not. And because people were able to leverage the way the training test cycle of these algorithms typically work, they had it saying some very offensive, tweeting out some very offensive things in no time. And it was a complete disaster. And that was just one of several highly visible cases where these algorithms and ethics kind of collided and put it on the map of a lot of technology companies and ML researchers. And it now is becoming a very rigorously part of the creation and the implementation of these algorithms. What happens, a terrible open question is what happens when you release facial recognition software that has biases attached to it because it's been mistrained? That's, the ramifications of that, it can be really dire. So there's a tremendous amount of responsibility now that needs to be incorporated into the adoption of any of these algorithms, no matter what kind of system it is. And, fortunately for us, that field of study and research, ethical AI, is one that's growing, and it's one that has gotten quite a few very smart researchers intrigued and involved in. And it's my hope that we're going to see as we move into more next generation algorithms and even more intelligent systems, we're going to be able to see a lot less inherent bias from the get-go, and we're going to be much more conscientious about the kinds of data sets that we incorporate into our training of these algorithms. So on the one hand, I don't want to say, everything's going to be great, just give it some time. But with that said, I'm very cautiously optimistic about the right people and minds aware of these issues and really starting to apply some brain power to them.
Thank you, Phil. So I'm going to read the Zoom chat. There's some questions in there. In the meantime, I'd encourage you to click the raise hand button if you want to ask your question verbally, and I will get to you.
I'd like to jump in with just a little more optimism on Phil's answer.
Sure, go ahead.
So one of the reasons that bias is so hard to fight, at least in the US, is because our legal system, our jurisprudence, says that we have to prove an individual instance was because of bias. This was racist, this was sexist, whatever. And this has gone to the Supreme Court in a couple of different areas in sentencing and housing discrimination, hiring, firing, et cetera. And every time the Supreme Court has said, yeah, but we can't say it was this one. You can show the patterns all you want, but we can't say for sure that this particular case was a result of that. And if it's decided automatically, if it's some kind of AI-based decision-making on a large scale, and we see bias in the outcome, we don't need to prove any individual case. We can say there's a problem with the algorithm, that the AI is biased, and make adjustments accordingly. So it's not just, it's nice that we have people who are interested in this, and we absolutely need to keep an eye on it from the start of these, developing these. But we also have an outcome measure that's actionable, which we don't really have in American jurisprudence as is.
I appreciate the qualification there. So one of the questions that got typed in Zoom, I'm going to restate it slightly. So the introduction of technology in the classroom, what would you say the goal is? Would you say the goal is to take a traditional bell curve? There's some students that are kind of on the lower end, some that are in the higher end, most are in the middle, and just raise everyone equally? Or is it designed to maybe change the distribution of the bell curve? Maybe you're doing a better job with technology of targeting maybe the bottom quartile of the classroom, or is it a combination of both? Is there a primary focus of one versus the other?
I've never thought of it that way. I guess it's difficult to put a pin on exactly like how would that translate within a bell curve, I guess, because bell curves are, I mean, they're essentially forcing people within a certain shape to measure within, right? So so if you just think of the technology, I think, for example, in adaptive instruction, if you think of what it's capable of doing, it's capable of targeting skill gaps for certain students and providing that remediation where needed, bring them back up to accelerate them. But it's also totally acceptable for students who are already achieving the core standards of a course to move beyond what it is that they are, and just ultimately getting the type of instruction that they really need and desire, probably because if we just try to make everybody in the classroom just have the same amount of learning, it's just that would never be realistic, right? Because everybody's coming in at a different level. And two, it's just not engaging for most students. Most students need to be taught exactly from where they are, and that's something that technology can really help us support our teaching to make sure that we can sort of individualize those lessons.
So I would agree that the question suggests kind of a curvilinear relationship. And I guess if we're just talking about an assessment that we give at the end of a course, yeah, I suppose we want to move the whole bell curve up. I imagine that's really our goal. But in the spirit of really changing the pedagogical framework, I think a larger and a more a worthier goal is to change how students approach instruction, to kind of imbue them with the sense that they can learn whatever they choose to learn, and that they have a framework in place, but they are learning to learn. They're learning to understand their own processes so that they can pursue education with varying degrees of independence going forward.
All right, yeah, thank you for that answer. So the person who asked the question asked a qualifying question, but technology should help those struggling who didn't get attention in the traditional teaching environment. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. Helping people that are struggling is because a teacher with 40 students in a classroom is going to spend a disproportionate amount of time dealing with a student who's really struggling. So having an infinitely patient system that's willing to work with them, that's willing to try different approaches and bring them up to some level, we have the potential to leave fewer children behind, to unfortunately use an old phrase, but we have that potential to do that, and I think that's absolutely a goal.
Does it also help identify those types of students for the teacher? Maybe it's twofold. It helps elevate and it helps identify.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right,
I mean,
great. Let me.
as an example, you know, just because you said 40, I had 39 students, and when I was teaching in San Diego in a 5th grade classroom, and you know, using a specific technology.
How many did you say?
39 students.
Wow.
And I had 50% performing below grade level at reading and math without using technology, you know, to actually support students to, I mean, I had kids who would also be on the other end of the scale, but, you know, yes, your attention is definitely going to those students who are in the lower end of the spectrum to help them, you know, come up. And without certain technology, I wouldn't have discovered something, for example, like, I mean, I was teaching an environment where there were many English language learners. Some of my English language learners, because of their background, were struggling with very simple sort of vowel sound recognition at the 5th grade level. You wouldn't expect that. I mean, that's a 1st grade teaching skill that I would have to, you know, be isolating and dropping down to. If I didn't have technology that was actually isolating that was the actual issue that was happening there, I wouldn't have been able to easily remediate that so that the students could, again, accelerate to get back up to the reading levels that they needed to be.
No, thank you for that. And yeah, the 39 students and half of them under, that's crazy.
It was a very interesting year, but
yeah, it sounds like
those kids were definitely my favorite year of teaching, for sure, because it was definitely the most challenging.
I've taught a 60-person classroom, and what inevitably winds up happening is you teach the people that want to learn, and you know, I can't make them pay attention and put their phones down. And well, I guess I could make them put their phones down, but I don't want to be a cop. You know, I want to be a teacher. So it's if they have tools that they can use at their own pace, and then potentially be more engaged in the lecture, the exercises in class, because they have some background information and they don't feel like they're behind, then that's an absolute win.
All right. This next question is from Michael. Michael, did you want to read your question, or did you want me to read it for you? All right, I'll just go ahead and read it for Michael here. If I wanted to set up an electrical engineering laboratory in a K-12 school right now, how can I filter out the STEM noise in the educational market and amalgamate useful content? How can I justify going to DigiKey and getting cheaper components rather than the expensive, educationally marketed kits, but still make it work efficiently? So if I wanted to sum that up, maybe one way to say that is, how can I get more effective content, not just expensive content?
I feel like I should be able to answer this because I built an electrical engineering system, but unfortunately I'm not familiar with DigiKey or really, and this always gets some head shakes, electrical engineering. I'm a psychologist. So the fact that I built the system was because they put different learning systems in front of me and I figured out how to make them work together. I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer the question in particular.
Let me restate it more generically then. How is it that you can evaluate the effectiveness of learning content? And what are the things you're looking for, especially from the lens of someone who's making a purchasing decision?
Hi, this is Michael. Can I just say something real quick here?
Sure.
All right, so I am an electrical engineer, and I don't know how to say this respectfully, but it's a feeling that I'm getting that there's a lot of junk out there. There's a lot of books. There's a lot of books marketed to the K through 12 market. There's a lot of online content where I feel like it was slopped together really fast to make a quick buck. You know what I mean? And then there's a lot of interesting stuff that's just out open source. Some of it is on Khan, some of it is on elsewhere. There's just so much stuff out there, and there's some people who are just trying to sell content, and some of them are winning because they know how to get to the purchasing department of public school systems, and so they grow based on that, and then they grow with the marketing. So I just want to set up this lab, and I want good content, and there's just too much stuff out there, and there's a lot of junk, and I'm feeling frustrated. You know what I mean? And DigiKey is just a supplier where you can get components for a few pennies, and then what happens if you buy the snap circuits kits, they mark them up to dollars and dollars. So there's, you know, some of us engineers, we're tinkerers. You know, we just go to the junkyard and pick up, you know, stuff out of the trash, and that culture is being lost. I know I'm loading a lot here, but part of this is a feeling of frustration.
Now, how do you cut through the BS? I guess we'll paraphrase.
I mean, I think one way to do it is to really look at the research that is backing these curriculums. So you're right, you're not wrong. Lots of things are slapped together. Lots of curriculum are really, 30 years old, just rebooted and with a nice glossy new cover on top to make it look like it's going to approach the content in a new way. And really they're just correlating a bunch of standards to it. And it's the same old that they've been selling for many, many years. I think the approach that I would take, and when I was, one of those folks who was actually on one of those panels for San Diego Unified, for example, applying whether or not we would get a certain curriculum. It's really just thinking through the research that is presented to you. Is it just marketing based, or did they actually do an independent study to validate the actual, to validate that what they're actually saying has outcome-based achievement? And I think that without, getting into the specifics, I'm not, I have never taught and, have never created anything around electrical and engineering. I think it's really just coming down to that evaluation process and making sure that that it's met and backed. Not just one of the things that is often said in curriculum, which to me is sort of a red flag, is when it's research based. That means that they are looking at research and trying to apply those tenets to that research. If they don't actively have a third-party independent research process that is either started or going on, that curriculum is probably not invested in doing that type of research, because it does cost money, and it is important that you're as invested in making sure that it actually works if you build it.
All right. Any of the panelists want to chime in?
I do know that for certain domains, at least, there are awards. They say this is important research. It's innovative. I don't know if there are any in particular for electrical engineering systems, but looking for some kind of, that's a third-party assessment, but it's a very visible kind of third-party assessment.
All right. Any other questions from the group? All right. Well, I certainly appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for coming. Panelists, thank you very much for the interesting conversations, the answers to your questions, being put on the spot a few times. Certainly the rest of us enjoyed watching you sweat. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.